This video will be my real and honest review of the Cougan Crossfire Trail. If you've watched my reviews in the past, you'll know that I don't hold anything back as far as things that I like and things that I don't like. I approach every review with a healthy bit of skepticism because I like to be critical enough to give you the right information to help you make a buying decision. And with a price tag of $10,000, you better believe I'm going to be critical of the bike. Now, you can get this bike in lower build options, lower price points, but this is their top of the line. Now, I'm going to start with the negatives and then I'll end with the positives, because when a bike gives an overall positive experience, I want to end with the positives. So starting with the negatives, with the lowest order of magnitude first, the shock is pretty low in the frame and upside down, which is great in one aspect, which we'll get into in a few minutes, but it does mean that you have to have this adapter to access the valve, and you've got to attach the shock pump underneath. Not that big of a deal, it's just not quite as easy to access as if it were up above. All right, moving on to the lockout for the front fork and the rear shock. It's nice that it is a double lockout in the sense that you just hit one lever and both the fork and the shock lock out at the same time. Now, this is more of a personal opinion. I don't really like remote lockouts. I like things as absolutely simple as possible, and that adds a little bit of complexity as far as building a bike, as far as maintenance. But for those of you who race, you're probably going to love the lockout. But the real problem for me is the fact that you have to have a lever that's above the bar for the dropper post. I do not like above the bar levers for dropper posts for a couple reasons. One is you have to take your thumb off and rotate it up to hit the lever, and oftentimes you're doing this in a sketchy situation where you need to get the saddle lower, but you're taking your very important opposing appendage and taking it off the bar and putting it above, and it actually is not as easy to push as a below the bar lever. And actually on one of my rides I found my thumb getting really tired because I was dropping it so much. I just don't like these above the bar, and I found myself getting into situations where I really needed to drop the post, and I would hit this and lock out the shock in the worst possible moment because it was getting sketchy. And then I just had to do the descent with the lockout locked with the, like a quick descent, and then I didn't drop the post. I'm just used to the lever being below the bar. It took me a long time to get used to it being above the bar, but again, it's probably a little bit more of a personal opinion, but I just don't feel like this bike even needs a remote lockout unless you're racing. But for trail riding, the pedaling platform, which I'll talk about later, is so good on this bike that I just personally don't think you need it. Now let's get into the biggest negative, and this is a negative in my book, and that is the internally routed cables through the headset. I'm not a fan, and I'll tell you why coming up here in a minute. Another kind of negative is the handlebar in one aspect. First, it's a 760 wide bar, really nice width. I like the width. The stem is pretty short, a nice length for the stem, but it is a pretty negative rise. I don't know the exact angle of the stem. I'll put that on the screen. I'll look it up on Cougan's website. I'm going to guess at least a -15. The bars for me were just too low. There were some situations on my local cross-country trails where the bar was nice for cornering, but if you look in relation to the saddle, you're a couple inches below the saddle. That is too low in my book for trail riding. I think bars equal to or slightly above the saddle are perfect for trail riding. And this is a 120 bike, so 120 millimeters of travel in the front, 120 in the rear. I'll talk about that coming up here in a minute. It limited me in terms of where I rode the bike. So I was going to take it on rougher terrain. I honestly did not feel comfortable on sketchy terrain. And when you're coming down sections where there's rocks and roots and the front end drops, it really drops as far as where your hands are located. And so I just felt like the bar was too low. Also on my local cross-country trails, which have a lot of fast cornering, after an hour and a half, 2 hours, my palms got tired and sore and my wrists got sore. So now let's really get into this internally routed cables through the headset. So you can see they go through the stem, and this is not the only bike that does this. A lot of Europeans bike do this. I think Scott bikes do this, but the inherent problem is the fact that you cannot run your own choice in stem and bar. For me, if I had this bike, I would want to put on an Industry 9 stem and a race face carbon handlebar. I can't do that because of the cable management system of the stem. You have to go with a stem that's made for that. Stem and handlebar is one of those things that's personal preference, and you can really change the cockpit to suit your preference, and you're just limited in that. And honestly, it's really the only big negative of this bike. Everything else about this bike is super positive. Again, I know a lot of bikes do it, but just to put ports on the side. Now, it is better than the old split housing cables that went through the frame. That was just an absolute nightmare. Once you get the bike set up, and if you get the cockpit to where you like it, you are golden, and it looks great, but you're just limited in your choices. It solves nothing, in my opinion, and only complicates the build. It complicates changing the headset bearings. All right, I'm done griping. Let's go on to the positives, because this bike has a lot of positives. The shifting on this bike with the SRAM XX transmission, just flawless, absolutely flawless. Perfect component spec for a bike like this. The Fox dropper worked great, other than the lever being above the bar. But as far as the fluidity of the dropper post, it was great. This Sella San Marco saddle is amazing. I may even get one of these. I really like these DT Swiss wheels. They are compliant enough for me, but very laterally stiff. 30 millimeters wide. They're pretty light. The Maxxis Recon Race tires, excellent choice on this bike. They are fast rolling, a lot of stability, a lot of cornering grip. So wheels and tires, just great. You can get this bike with alloy wheels, but if your budget allows, I would recommend getting these carbon DT Swiss, the XRC 1501s. Just a phenomenal wheel set. The Magura brakes were good. They have a very SRAM feeling, so not the initial bite and grabbiness of Shimano, which I actually prefer Shimano. But overall feel was good. They have really good modulation. Again, felt a lot like SRAM brakes. So no real complaints there. The biggest positive of this bike is the ride quality. This is a very balanced bike. And the lateral stiffness of the suspension is second to none. It is just a tight feeling suspension in a very good way, in the sense that when you pedal, it just does not flex side to side. You feel like you just have control from the rear end. A bike that has a flexy rear end can be hard to control in rough situations, rough terrain. But this bike is, the bearings are high quality. The pivots have really tight tolerances to where the bike is just laterally stiff. Again, it's balanced in the sense that the front end and the rear end just both feel stiff and compliant. The pedaling platform is great. Like I mentioned earlier, you really don't need a lockout. I never use the lockout on the trail. Lee Cougan have built a suspension platform that this bike just goes. This to me is a cross-country bike with down-country capabilities. And the pedaling platform really helps with that. So stomping on the pedals, out of the saddle, in the saddle, this bike does not bob. It just absolutely goes when you pedal it. I also really like the low center of gravity. So you can see the shock down low in the frame. The pivots are down low. And the bottom bracket height, I don't know exactly what it is, but it is a very nice bottom bracket height in the sense that it's low, so you get really good cornering performance, but it's not too low to where you're getting pedal strikes. I think I maybe had like 1 or 2 pedal strikes on this bike, which you do on every bike, but yet the bike had a pretty low center of gravity. So yeah, everything about the way this frame is designed is just spot on. I would say as far as bump absorption, the rear shock is not quite as small bump sensitive as other 120 bikes that I've ridden, but it really opens up nicely when you hit bigger stuff. And so if you're out of the saddle coming down something and you hit some big hits, it just absorbs it really nicely. But you know, you can't have everything, right? So a bike that's really, really small bump sensitive is not going to have a solid pedaling platform. So I feel like the fact that it really absorbs bigger hits, but yet is still a good pedaling platform is a very good compromise. So to wrap it up, this is a bike that literally can be raced at the highest level at a little over 24 pounds complete. It's as light as you need for a cross-country bike. Add the fact that it's 120 front and rear. It is not only a super fast cross-country bike, it is a very capable trail bike that it's a blast to ride, even on rougher stuff. The fact that the bike is so light means you can just shoot up those short, punchy climbs, and when you're coming down, you can just move it around however you need to. And I'm telling you, on my local trails, I had an absolute blast on this bike. If the handlebars were just a little bit higher, this bike for me would be perfect. I wish I could put on my own bar and stem and experience it like that. But, you know, like I said, the overall experience on this bike, super positive. I don't say this about every demo bike, in fact, very few, but this gets the Clint Gibbs stamp of approval. And it's just a quality bike. Like the paint job, I mentioned that in my first look. If you haven't watched that, that's where I go over all the specs and everything. But the paint job, it's everything about this bike is quality and rides super well. So it's a bike I can recommend. If you've ridden this bike, let us know in the comments below if you agree with me, if you disagree. We'd love to hear your opinion. If you have any other questions, go ahead and drop those below and I'll try to answer them as best that I can. All right, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Thanks for watching.